Cinderella, a classic fairy tale. Once upon a time, in a peaceful and distant kingdom surrounded by lush forests and rolling hills, there lived a young girl named Cinderella. She was known throughout her village for her striking beauty, which was matched only by her gentle nature and kind spirit. Her long, golden hair shimmered in the sunlight, and her bright blue eyes sparkled with a warmth that could melt even the coldest of hearts. Cinderella had a natural grace about her, not just in the way she moved, but in the way she treated everyone around her with respect. Kindness, and an unwavering sense of compassion. Cinderella's early life was filled with joy and love. She lived in a comfortable home with her father, a wealthy merchant who adored her, and her mother, who was as kind-hearted and gentle as Cinderella herself. They raised her with care, instilling in her a deep sense of empathy and optimism. Her mother would often tell her, "No matter what hardships you face, remember to always be kind and patient, for kindness is the greatest strength of all." But tragedy struck when Cinderella's mother fell gravely ill and passed away. The once happy home became filled with sorrow, and Cinderella's father, heartbroken and lonely, decided to remarry. He chose a woman who appeared charming and elegant on the surface, hoping she would be a good mother to Cinderella. However, this woman, known simply as the stepmother, was far from kind. She had two daughters of her own, who were as spiteful and selfish as she was. Unlike Cinderella, who radiated goodness, the stepsisters were vain, jealous, and always eager to belittle others to make themselves feel superior. Not long after the marriage, Cinderella's father also passed away unexpectedly, leaving her completely alone with her new family. With no one left to protect her, the true nature of the stepmother and her daughters was revealed. They saw Cinderella as nothing more than a nuisance, a shadow of the household's former happiness, and they quickly resolved to rid themselves of her presence in any way they could. Cinderella was stripped of her fine clothes and jewelry, which her stepsisters eagerly took for themselves. She was no longer treated as part of the family, but rather as a lowly servant. From dawn until dusk, Cinderella was forced to complete all the housework, from scrubbing floors to washing clothes, tending to the fire, and preparing meals for her stepmother and stepsisters. Her once soft hands became rough and callous, her delicate skin often smudged with soot, and her lovely clothes were replaced by tattered rags. Her bedroom was moved from the warm, comfortable quarters she once knew to the cold, dusty attic, a dark and dreary space filled with cobwebs and drafts. She slept on a simple straw mattress with only a thin blanket to keep her warm during the chilly nights, while her stepsisters lounged in luxury, surrounded by soft cushions and fine fabrics. Cinderella endured the loneliness and isolation of her attic room, listening to the howling wind through the cracks in the roof. Despite all of this, Cinderella never let her spirit be broken. When they demanded more of her time and energy, she never complained or sought revenge. Her love for all living things remained intact, and she often found solace in the company of the animals around the house. The birds and mice became her only true companions, and she would talk to them as if they could understand her, sharing her hopes and dreams with them. In return, they brought her moments of happiness and comfort, showing her that even in a world filled with cruelty, there was still room for kindness and friendship. Though her life was full of hardship, Cinderella remained resilient. Her kindness, rather than being a sign of weakness, was a source of her inner strength. She believed that one day, something good would come her way and her suffering would end. Until that day came, she continued to do her best to remain gracious, never letting the bitterness of her step-family poison her pure heart. The invitation to the royal ball. One bright morning, the entire kingdom was buzzing with excitement as a royal proclamation was made. The king had decided to host a grand ball in honor of his beloved son, the prince, who was now of age and seeking a bride. The king, eager to find a perfect match for the prince, wanted to make this event the most magnificent celebration the kingdom had ever seen. Messengers were dispatched to every corner of the realm, carrying beautifully written invitations sealed with the royal crest. These invitations were delivered to all the eligible maidens in the kingdom, inviting them to attend the ball in the grand royal palace. For many, this was the opportunity of a lifetime. The ball would be a night of enchantment, elegance, and the chance to meet the prince, whose charm and good looks were renowned throughout the land. Among the women of the kingdom, no one was more excited than Cinderella's stepsisters. They could hardly contain their glee when the invitation arrived at their doorstep, their eyes widening with anticipation. Each sister believed that she had a chance to win the prince's heart and secure a life of luxury and prestige. From that moment on, the stepsisters became utterly obsessed with preparing for the ball. They spent weeks fussing over every detail of their appearance, determined to outshine every other girl in the kingdom. The household was consumed with constant chatter about fabrics, hairstyles, and jewels. They ordered the finest silks and laces, consulted with tailors about the latest fashions, and had their dresses tailored to perfection. They preened and practiced their smiles in front of mirrors, debating which colors would flatter them most and arguing over which accessories would catch the prince's eye. The stepsisters' vanity knew no bounds, and they treated the preparations as a competition for the prince's favor. Amid the flurry of preparations, they took every opportunity to mock Cinderella. As they watched her diligently scrub the floors or hang their newly cleaned gowns, they taunted her mercilessly, saying things like, "What a pity, Cinderella! Can you imagine yourself at the royal ball in those filthy rags?" The prince would laugh at you. Their laughter rang through the house as they reminded her that she had no chance of attending such a prestigious event. "What would you wear? Those ashes?" one of the stepsisters sneered, referring to the soot that often covered Cinderella from head to toe after long hours of housework. Cinderella, who had overheard the royal proclamation and longed to go to the ball, felt a pang in her heart each time they teased her. She imagined herself at the grand palace, twirling in a beautiful gown and maybe even catching a glimpse of the prince. The thought of dancing under the glittering chandeliers was a dream she couldn't shake. Summoning her courage, she approached her stepmother one evening as they sat together. Her voice was soft and hesitant, yet full of hope, as she asked, "Stepmother, may I go to the ball as well?" The stepmother, who had been feigning politeness up until that moment, turned to Cinderella with a cruel smirk. "You go to the ball?" she said mockingly, raising an eyebrow. "Very well, you may go on one condition." Cinderella's heart leapt with excitement, but her stepmother's next words shattered that hope. "You can attend the ball if you finish all your chores," she said with a malicious gleam in her eye. "And you must also find something suitable to wear. After all, we can't have you showing up in rags." Cinderella's heart sank. The stepmother's demand was deliberately impossible. She knew that the list of chores she would be given would be endless scrubbing the floors, cleaning the entire house, polishing the silver, ironing their dresses, and more. Even if by some miracle she completed all the tasks, she had no gown to wear. Unlike her stepsisters, she had no fancy fabrics, no jewels, and no way to transform her humble, tattered clothes into something worthy of a royal ball. Her hopes were crushed, and a deep sadness began to settle within her. As the night of the ball approached, Cinderella watched helplessly as her stepsisters excitedly prepared for the grand event. On the day of the ball, the household was filled with frantic energy as the stepsisters shrieked for Cinderella to assist them, tightening corsets, adjusting hairpins, and fastening elaborate jewelry. They made sure every detail was perfect, fully believing that one of them would win the prince's heart. As the hour drew near, the carriage arrived to take them to the palace. The stepsisters, glowing in their gowns of bright silk and velvet, made their way to the door with their stepmother, who looked on with approval at her daughter's appearance. Cinderella stood in the doorway, her eyes filled with longing as she watched them prepare to leave. "Goodbye, Cinderella," they sneered as they swept out of the house, laughing as they climbed into the carriage. "Don't stay up too late scrubbing the floors." As the sound of the carriage wheels faded into the distance, Cinderella was left standing alone in the empty house. The silence pressed heavily upon her. She walked slowly to her small, cold room in the attic and sat down on the edge of her bed. Tears welled up in her eyes, and despite her efforts to hold them back, they began to fall. Cinderella sobbed quietly, her dreams of the ball, of dancing beneath the stars, slipping away with each tear. The appearance of the fairy godmother, as Cinderella sat on the cold, hard floor of her attic room, her sobs echoed softly in the quiet night. Her heart was heavy with sorrow, and tears streamed down her cheeks, each drop a reflection of her shattered hopes. She felt utterly alone, trapped in a life of servitude, unable to escape the cruel grasp of her stepfamily. Just when it seemed as though all hope was lost, something extraordinary began to happen. The dim light of the room suddenly grew warm and bright, filling the space with a soft, golden glow. Cinderella, still weeping, was startled by the change and looked up, wiping her tears away. There, standing before her, was a figure unlike any she had ever seen. In the center of the room appeared a radiant woman, her entire being illuminated by a magical light. She was surrounded by a gentle shimmer, as if the very air around her was filled with stardust. Her fairy godmother had arrived. The fairy godmother was an ethereal and elegant figure, with a face that exuded both kindness and wisdom. She was dressed in robes of the most delicate silvery blue fabric that seemed to flow like water, glistening with tiny sparkles, as if the stars themselves had woven her gown. Her silvery hair was swept up into a graceful bun, adorned with a delicate tiara that glimmered in the warm light. Her eyes, filled with understanding and compassion, gazed softly at Cinderella. "Why are you crying, my dear?" the fairy godmother asked in a voice that was gentle yet firm, like a comforting lullaby. Cinderella, still in disbelief, could hardly find the words. "I can't go to the ball," she stammered, her voice trembling with sadness. "I have no dress, no way to get there, and my stepmother would never allow it." The fairy godmother smiled warmly and placed a hand on Cinderella's shoulder. "Nonsense, my dear," she said kindly. "You shall go to the ball. All you need is a little bit of magic and a lot of faith." With that, she raised her delicate wand, which shimmered with a faint golden light. With a soft flick of her wand, the fairy godmother began to work her magic. First, she turned toward a humble pumpkin sitting in the corner of the kitchen, a remnant of Cinderella's daily chores. She twirled her wand with a flourish, and in an instant, the pumpkin began to grow. It expanded and transformed, its orange skin turning a brilliant gold, its vine-like stems twisting and reshaping themselves until, before Cinderella's eyes, it became a magnificent carriage, elegant and shimmering, fit for royalty. Next, the fairy godmother turned to the small mice that had been Cinderella's only companions in her lonely attic. With another wave of her wand, the mice began to change. Their tiny forms grew larger, their fur taking on a glossy sheen as they transformed into proud, noble horses, each one as white as snow and adorned with fine bridles and plumes. Their ears twitched as they pawed the ground, eager to begin their journey. As Cinderella watched in awe, the fairy godmother noticed a rat scurrying across the floor. With a knowing smile, she gave a soft wave of her wand, and the rat, once scrawny and plain, stood tall, transforming into a dignified coachman dressed in fine livery. He tipped his hat to Cinderella and took his place at the head of the carriage, ready to drive her to the royal ball. But the most wondrous transformation was yet to come. The fairy godmother turned to Cinderella herself, whose tattered clothes still clung to her, stained from hours of hard work. With a graceful sweep of her wand, the fairy godmother enveloped Cinderella in a shower of sparkling light. The rags that once defined her melted away, replaced by a stunning gown of shimmering silver. The fabric flowed like liquid moonlight, every inch of it adorned with intricate lace and tiny, sparkling gems that caught the light with every movement. Cinderella's hair, once tied back in a simple, messy bun, was transformed into soft, flowing curls that cascaded down her shoulders. And then, with a final flick of her wand, the fairy godmother conjured a pair of exquisite glass slippers, each one so delicate and clear that they seemed to be made of the finest crystal, yet they sparkled like diamonds under the light. Cinderella could hardly believe her eyes. She twirled slowly, the gown swirling around her like a soft breeze, the slippers glittering with each step. For the first time in her life, she felt truly beautiful, like a princess out of a dream. Her heart swelled with hope and excitement at the thought of attending the ball, of dancing in the grand palace, and perhaps even meeting the prince. But before Cinderella could lose herself entirely in her newfound joy, the fairy godmother gently placed a hand on her arm and spoke with a hint of caution in her voice. "Remember, my dear, this magic is powerful, but temporary," she said kindly, but firmly. "It will only last until the stroke of midnight. At that moment, everything will return to its original form. The carriage will be a pumpkin again, the horses will be mice, and your gown will return to rags. So, you must leave the ball before midnight." Cinderella nodded, her heart full of gratitude. She would not let the time limit dampen her spirits. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes shining with appreciation. "I will remember." With one final smile, the fairy godmother helped her into the grand carriage. With her heart filled with hope and excitement, Cinderella climbed into the carriage, which gleamed under the light of the moon. The horses neighed, the coachman tipped his hat once more, and with a flick of the reins, the carriage began its journey toward the royal palace. As they rode off into the night, Cinderella couldn't help but feel that this night, one filled with magic and dreams, was the beginning of something extraordinary. The ball and the prince, the night of the royal ball, had arrived, and the grand palace was a sight to behold. Golden chandeliers hung from the high, vaulted ceilings, casting a warm, radiant glow over the ballroom, where the finest nobles from across the kingdom gathered. The marble floors gleamed beneath the shimmering gowns and polished shoes of the guests. Music filled the air, a symphony of strings and harps echoing through the grand hall as the court's most eligible young women danced and mingled, each hoping to catch the eye of the prince. Amidst the glittering crowd, Cinderella entered the palace with her heart fluttering in her chest. As she stepped through the grand doors, the entire ballroom seemed to pause, all eyes turning toward her in awe. Her gown, made of shimmering silver, sparkled under the soft candlelight, and her glass slippers glistened like jewels with each graceful step she took. Cinderella's beauty wasn't like anything the guests had ever seen, but it wasn't just her appearance that captivated the room. There was an air of grace, kindness, and elegance about her that drew everyone's gaze. At the far end of the ballroom, the prince stood among the nobility, surrounded by many young women eager to gain his attention. However, the moment Cinderella entered the room, his eyes were drawn to her, as if by some invisible force. The chatter and laughter of the other guests faded into the background as the prince became completely entranced by the mysterious girl. He had never seen such grace and beauty, and it was as if time itself had slowed when she appeared. Without hesitation, the prince excused himself from the crowd of admirers and walked toward Cinderella, his heart racing. The room seemed to part like the sea as he made his way to her, ignoring the disappointed sighs of the other young women who had been vying for his attention. Reaching Cinderella, he extended his hand with a smile. "May I have this dance?" he asked, his voice soft, but filled with admiration. Cinderella, who had never imagined she would be in such a moment, felt her heart skip a beat. She gently placed her hand in his, her cheeks flushing with a mixture of surprise and joy. "Of course," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the music. The prince led her to the center of the ballroom, and as the musicians began to play a waltz, they started to dance. The room, once filled with the laughter and conversation of the guests, fell silent as everyone watched the prince and the mysterious girl glide across the floor. Cinderella moved with a natural elegance, her gown swirling around her like a silvery cloud, and her smile lighting up the room. The prince held her close, his eyes never leaving hers, as if he had known her his whole life. They danced as though no one else was present, completely lost in each other's company. As the evening wore on, the prince and Cinderella shared more than just dances. They talked and laughed, finding joy in each other's stories and words. The prince, who had grown weary of the formalities of court life, was captivated by Cinderella's kindness and wit. Cinderella, in turn, felt a connection with the prince that went far beyond mere charm and status. For the first time in her life, she was being treated with respect and admiration, not as a servant, but as someone valued and cherished. The ballroom, filled with the brightest stars of nobility, had faded into the background. The prince's heart was no longer concerned with finding a bride from the wealthiest or most prestigious families. All he saw was the kind-hearted and beautiful girl before him, who had effortlessly stolen his attention. The other guests could only watch in awe as the two continued their dance, whispering to each other as if sharing a secret that no one else could understand. However, as the evening drew on, Cinderella became so swept up in the magic of the moment that she forgot about the one condition her fairy godmother had warned her of: the magic would only last until midnight. The minutes slipped away unnoticed, and soon the clock in the grand hall began to chime, its deep tones echoing through the palace. At the sound of the clock striking midnight, Cinderella's heart leapt in panic. She remembered the fairy godmother's warning. Once the final chime sounded, her gown, the carriage, and everything around her would return to their original, humble forms. Humble forms. Her splendid gown would become tattered rags once again, and her carriage would be nothing more than a pumpkin. She could not let the prince see her like that. With sudden urgency, she pulled away from the prince, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm sorry, but I have to go," she said hurriedly, turning toward the grand staircase that led out of the ballroom. The prince, startled by her sudden departure, reached out for her. "Wait," he called after her, confusion and heartache in his voice, but Cinderella could not stay to explain. She could not tell him about the magic or her true identity. She gathered her skirts and ran, her feet moving as fast as they could across the ballroom floor. Her glass slippers made soft clicks against the marble as she fled, her heart pounding in her chest. As she descended the grand staircase, the clock continued to chime, its ringing growing louder with each passing second. In her rush, one of her glass slippers slipped off her foot and landed on the steps with a soft thud, but Cinderella didn't stop to pick it up. She had no time. The prince, heartbroken and bewildered by her sudden flight, followed her out of the ballroom. He reached the grand staircase, just in time to see her disappear into the night, her silver gown shimmering in the moonlight as she vanished from sight. He looked down and saw the delicate glass slipper lying on the steps, glistening like a precious jewel. The prince gently picked up the slipper, turning it over in his hands. His heart was heavy with longing, but he knew one thing for certain: he would find her. This mysterious girl, who had stolen his heart in a single night, wasn't like anyone he had ever met. Clutching the slipper, he vowed to search the kingdom until he found the one whose foot would fit the shoe. She was the one he had been waiting for, and he would not rest until she was by his side again. The search for Cinderella. The morning after the ball, the palace was buzzing with excitement. The prince, still holding the delicate glass slipper, made a bold declaration. He would marry the girl whose foot perfectly fit the slipper. His heart was set on finding the mysterious woman who had stolen his heart, and nothing would stop him. The king, determined to support his son's quest for love, ordered that royal messengers be sent across the entire kingdom. Armed with the glass slipper, these trusted servants were tasked with finding the young woman who had enchanted the prince. With great urgency, the prince's men traveled from village to village, visiting every home, no matter how grand or humble. They brought the slipper to every eligible maiden, hoping to find the one whose foot would slip into the tiny, exquisite shoe. Word of the search spread quickly, and as the news reached the ears of hopeful young women across the land, many rushed to prepare themselves for the prince's visit. For most, it seemed like the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to become royalty. At each house, the same scene played out. Women of all ages and backgrounds eagerly lined up to try on the delicate slipper, each hoping that it would fit and that they would be chosen as the prince's bride. Some attempted to force their feet into the shoe, painfully squeezing and straining. In a desperate attempt to make it fit, others approached with more subtlety, but none succeeded. The slipper was simply too small for anyone who tried. Eventually, the prince's servants reached the grand, imposing house on the outskirts of the kingdom, the home of Cinderella's stepmother and stepsisters. The two stepsisters had been waiting impatiently for their turn to try on the slipper. Each was convinced that she alone deserved to become the prince's bride. They adorned themselves in their finest dresses and jewelry, doing everything they could to impress the royal messengers. Their eyes gleamed with ambition as they awaited their chance. When the prince's men entered the house, the stepsisters hurriedly sat down, pushing each other aside in their eagerness to be the first to try the slipper. The older stepsister, with an air of false grace, delicately lifted her foot, confident that it would fit. But as the servant placed the glass slipper on her foot, it became immediately clear that it was far too small. The sister winced and tried to force her foot into the shoe, but no amount of effort could make it fit. The servant gently shook his head, and the slipper was passed to the younger stepsister. The younger sister, just as eager, took her turn. She was determined to make the slipper fit at any cost. She shoved her foot into the shoe, her face twisting in discomfort as she pushed harder. But, like her sister before her foot was simply too large. No matter how hard she tried, the glass slipper would not fit. The stepmother, watching with growing frustration, attempted to hide her disappointment. She had been so sure that one of her daughters would become the next princess, and she refused to believe that their chance was slipping away. As the royal messengers prepared to leave, thinking that the search was over for this house, something unexpected happened. In the corner of the room, Cinderella quietly appeared, her presence unnoticed by her stepmother and stepsisters until she stepped forward. Her soft, gentle voice broke the silence. "May I try the slipper?" she asked, her eyes filled with quiet hope. Her stepmother and stepsisters turned to her in shock. They had forbidden Cinderella from even considering the idea that she could be the one the prince sought. Now, seeing her standing there with quiet confidence, they erupted into mocking laughter. "You," the older stepsister sneered. "How could you possibly be the one? You didn't even attend the ball," the younger stepsister added. "Don't be ridiculous. You're nothing but a servant." But Cinderella, despite their cruel words, remained calm. She knew something they did not. She was the girl from the ball, the one who had danced with the prince and captured his heart, fitting her as if it had been made just for her. The room fell into stunned silence. Her stepsisters gasped, their faces frozen in disbelief. They had never imagined that their stepsister, whom they had treated so poorly, could be the one destined to become the prince's bride. But the shock didn't end there. Cinderella reached into the folds of her simple dress and produced the matching glass slipper, the one that had remained with her after the ball. She handed it to the servant, and when he placed it on her other foot, the transformation was complete. There was no denying now that Cinderella was the mysterious girl from the ball, the one the prince had been searching for. Her stepmother, watching in utter horror, could not believe what she was seeing. She had spent years treating Cinderella as nothing more than a servant, convinced that her own daughters were far more deserving of happiness and fortune. And yet, here was Cinderella radiant, graceful, and beloved by the prince. The royal servant, filled with joy at having finally found the girl they had been searching for, rose to his feet and bowed deeply before Cinderella. "My lady," he said with great respect, "the prince has been waiting for you." He summoned the carriage that had been prepared for her, ready to take her to the palace, where the prince waited anxiously to be reunited with the girl he had danced with the night before. Cinderella, filled with gratitude and joy, glanced back at her stepmother and stepsisters. Though they had treated her with cruelty for so many years, she offered them a gentle smile. She knew her future was bright, and as she stepped into the carriage, her heart swelled with the knowledge that she was about to begin a new chapter of her life, one filled with kindness, love, and a happily ever after. The happy ending. Not long after Cinderella was found, the prince himself arrived at her home, eager and filled with anticipation. As he stepped through the door, his heart raced, knowing that the search for his mysterious love was finally over. When his eyes fell upon Cinderella, standing before him in her simple but elegant manner, there was no doubt in his mind she was the girl from the ball, the one who had captivated his heart with her beauty, kindness, and grace. The moment they shared eye contact, the connection they had felt the night before returned, even stronger than before. The prince, his face lighting up with joy, approached Cinderella. "It's you," he said softly, his voice full of admiration and relief. "I've been searching for you everywhere." Overwhelmed with happiness, he took her hand and, in front of everyone present, dropped to one knee. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his voice full of hope and sincerity. Cinderella, overcome with emotion, felt her eyes well up with tears of joy. This was the moment she had never dared to dream of. The prince, who had seen her not just for her outer beauty, but for her heart, was asking her to be his princess. She looked down at him with a smile that radiated happiness and love. "Yes, I will," she replied without hesitation, her voice full of excitement. Her stepmother and stepsisters, who had watched the scene unfold in disbelief, stood in stunned silence. Their years of cruelty had led them to believe that Cinderella could never rise above her role as a servant. And yet, here she was chosen by the prince, destined to become a princess. In that moment, they realized the depth of their mistakes. Shame and guilt washed over them as they saw how their jealousy had blinded them to Cinderella's true worth. Despite the years of torment, Cinderella's heart remained pure. She turned to her stepmother and stepsisters, who stood with their heads bowed in shame. Instead of resentment, she felt only compassion. The prince, noticing Cinderella's gaze upon her family, looked at her curiously, but Cinderella, always kind and gracious, spoke softly. "I forgive you." Her words were sincere, a reflection of her unwavering heart, one that had not been hardened by cruelty. She chose to offer them grace, a kindness they had never shown her. Her stepmother and stepsisters were taken aback by her words. Tears filled their eyes, not out of sadness, but out of the deep remorse they felt for how they had treated her. They had never expected Cinderella, who had every reason to turn her back on them, to show such mercy and forgiveness. They realized that true beauty lay not just in appearance, but in the heart, a lesson they had learned from the very girl they had tried to diminish. The day of Cinderella and the prince's wedding came soon after, and it was a celebration like no other. The entire kingdom rejoiced, for it was not just the union of a prince and his bride, but a story of hope, kindness, and love that had triumphed over adversity. The palace was adorned with flowers of every color, and the air was filled with the sweet scent of roses and lilac. Nobles from across the land gathered to witness the joyous occasion, but the most important guests were the everyday people of the kingdom, who had heard the story of the kind-hearted girl who had been mistreated yet never lost her spirit. Cinderella arrived at the palace in a grand carriage, dressed in a gown of the finest silk, embroidered with delicate pearls and lace. Her glass slippers, which had played such a significant role in bringing her and the prince together, glittered beneath her dress as she walked gracefully down the aisle. The people watched in awe as she made her way to the prince, who stood at the altar waiting for her. There was no doubt that she belonged there not because of her newfound title, but because of the light and love she carried within her. As Cinderella and the prince exchanged vows, there was not a dry eye in the room. The prince's love for Cinderella was evident in every word he spoke, his voice steady and filled with devotion. Cinderella, too, spoke her vows with love and sincerity, her heart overflowing with gratitude for the life she was about to begin with the man who had seen her for who she truly was. The moment they were pronounced husband and wife, the entire kingdom erupted into cheers of joy. The couple shared a kiss, sealing their bond, and from that moment on, Cinderella was no longer the girl forced to live in the shadows. She was a princess, beloved by all. After the grand wedding, the celebrations continued throughout the kingdom for days. Banquets, feasts, and grand balls were held in honor of the new princess and her prince. People from every village came to catch a glimpse of Cinderella, whose story had inspired so many. But it wasn't just her beauty that captivated them, it was her inner strength, her resilience, and her kind heart. Cinderella became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the face of hardship, goodness would always prevail. As a princess, Cinderella ruled alongside her husband with the same grace and compassion she had always shown. She was known throughout the kingdom as a ruler who cared deeply for her people, often visiting the villages and speaking to them directly, offering help and support wherever it was needed. She treated everyone with kindness, from the richest noble to the poorest peasant. Her stepmother and stepsisters, though they had lost their chance at royal favor, were not left behind. Cinderella ensured they were well cared for, showing them that forgiveness and compassion were the truest forms of strength. The years passed, and Cinderella and the prince lived a long and happy life together. Their love only grew stronger as time went on, and the people of the kingdom adored them both. Cinderella became a beloved figure in her kingdom, not just for her beauty, but for the light and goodness she brought to everyone around her. And so, Cinderella's story, one that began with hardship and cruelty, ended in a happily ever after. She had overcome every obstacle with grace and emerged as a symbol of kindness and hope, living a life filled with love, joy, and compassion. Her legacy would be remembered for generations, a reminder that no matter the circumstances, true goodness and inner beauty would always triumph. I hope you enjoyed this video and have been useful. If you want, you can share this video with other people so that they also learn to speak English. Remember that in the channel, you will find more interesting content that will allow you to consolidate more knowledge. Repeat the content as many times as you want. You can also leave me a comment, tell me your experience, ask me a question, or suggest a special topic for the next video. I will love to read and reply to you. Thank you very much for your attention.